The document was trembling in Helena Thorne's hands, and not because of the cold. She stood in the center of the Obsidian Court's grand chamber, 60 feet beneath the city of Vienna, surrounded by creatures who had watched empires crumble and not blinked once. The vaulted ceiling arched overhead like the ribcage of something ancient and enormous, carved from black stone that seemed to breathe. Torches burned in silver sconces, casting everything in amber and shadow, and every pair of eyes in that room, pale, luminous, dangerous, was fixed on her. "The bargain is sealed," announced Lord Casimir Draveth, the court's high arbiter, his voice rolling through the chamber like distant thunder. He was tall even by vampire standards, white-haired and white-skinned, his face a mask of aristocratic contempt. The human concedes. The debt of House Thorne passes to the court in perpetuity. There is nothing left to discuss. Helena did not concede. Not yet. She read the line again. Clause 17. Buried so deeply in the archaic Latin of the contract that any person who hadn't spent 3 sleepless nights translating century-old legal text with a law dictionary and an academic paper on vampire blood law would have missed it entirely. Her eyes moved across the words a third time, making absolutely certain she understood. "Actually," Helena said, and her voice did not shake, "there is something left to discuss." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when a mouse stands in the center of a room full of cats and clears its throat. Lord Casimir's pale eyes narrowed to silver slits. Around the curved gallery above the chamber floor, other members of the court leaned forward on their carved balconies. Some of them were smiling, not kindly. "The human speaks," murmured Lady Serafova from the upper tier, her voice like silk drawn across a blade. "How charming." "Let her speak," said a voice from the far end of the chamber, low and absolute, and carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to command an entire room. Every head turned. Ambrose Volkov descended the 3 wide steps from the court's upper dais, as though he owned not merely the room but every room that had ever existed. He was the most striking creature Helena had ever seen, which was saying something given the company she'd kept for the past 3 hours. White hair fell past his shoulders, straight and silver as moonlight on water. His skin was pale as polished ivory, and his eyes were the deep, unsettling grey of storm clouds at midnight. He moved with the particular economy of someone who had never once in several centuries wasted emotion on anything unnecessary. He wore black, simply and perfectly, and the ring on his right hand bore the crest of House Volkov, one of the oldest vampire dynasties on the continent. He was the court's appointed sovereign witness. He was not supposed to interfere. He stopped 6 feet from Helena and looked at the document in her hands, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. "What does she claim?" he asked, addressing neither Casimir nor Helena specifically, but the room at large. In that way powerful people sometimes spoke when they wanted everyone to feel addressed. Helena answered before anyone else could. "Clause 17 of the Compact of Binding," she said clearly, holding the document up. Subsection C. It states, and I am quoting directly, that any debt of mortal inheritance passed to the court under Article 9 is rendered void in its entirety if the originating human party can demonstrate that the debt was incurred under conditions of supernatural coercion, as defined under the blood law of 1743. She lowered the document and met Casimir's silver gaze without flinching. "My father did not sign the original agreement freely. He signed it under thrall." The chamber erupted. It had taken Helena Thorne 4 months to reach this moment, and it had started, of all places, at her shift at the Red Lantern bar. She had been waitressing there for 2 years, working double shifts on weekends and squeezing in shifts during the week around her university coursework in contract law. The Red Lantern was the kind of place that existed in every city if you knew which streets to avoid and which doors to open, dimly lit, well-stocked, and patronized heavily by the city's vampire population after nightfall. Vienna's supernatural community was an open secret, the sort of thing polite humans simply didn't discuss, like property prices or what exactly was in the sausage. Helena had always been practical about the vampires. They tipped well, rarely caused trouble if you were straightforward with them, and the bar's arrangement with the local court meant the place was considered neutral territory, which made it one of the safest locations in the city to work late nights. She'd learned quickly not to stare, not to flinch, and to refill glasses without comment. She had been refilling a glass of blood wine, the real kind, deep crimson and smelling of iron and dark fruit, when the man at table 7 had looked up at her, and she'd realized with a lurch in her chest that she recognized him. He had been in the bar 3 times that month. Always alone. Always at table 7 in the far corner where the shadows were deepest. Always with a glass of blood wine and a leather-bound ledger he wrote in with an old-fashioned pen. She had served him without incident each time, noting only that he had the most extraordinary stillness of any person she'd ever encountered, human or otherwise, and that his eyes, that deep storm cloud grey, tracked her movements with the particular attentiveness of a creature to whom nothing was incidental. "You remember me," he said. It was not a question. "You sit at the same table and order the same thing," Helena replied, setting down the wine and pulling out her notepad. "I'd be a poor waitress if I didn't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise, exactly. More like recalibration. "You are not afraid of me, should I be?" "Most humans who know what I am are." Helena glanced around the bar at the pale-skinned regulars, at the human patrons who instinctively clustered near the entrance, at the particular way the low light caught in eyes that reflected just slightly too much of it. "I've worked here 2 years, she said. "If I were going to be afraid, I'd have started earlier. Will you be wanting anything else tonight?" "Your name," he said, and she stopped. She considered it for a moment, then, "Helena." "And yours?" "Ambrose Volkov." She wrote nothing on her notepad. She was fairly certain she didn't need to. She had the feeling this was not the kind of man who forgot things, and she was also fairly certain she wasn't going to forget this conversation either. It was 3 nights later, on her next shift, that he'd arrived at table 7 again and waited until the bar had thinned out before asking for her to sit with him for a moment. He'd produced a slim envelope from his jacket and placed it on the table between them without explanation. "I am going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to read what's in that envelope before you respond to me." Helena opened the envelope. Inside was a single page of official-looking letterhead from the Obsidian Court, and it took her approximately 45 seconds of reading to understand what it meant. Her father's name was on the document. Her father, who had died 3 years ago and left behind nothing but a small apartment, a collection of second-hand books, and what she had always assumed was a manageable amount of debt. "This says, my father owed the court 80,000 euros, she said. "It says your father's estate owed the court 80,000 euros, Ambrose corrected. "And that as the sole surviving heir, the debt passes to you." Helena set the paper down very carefully on the table. "My father never mentioned vampires. Ever, I know. He may not have fully understood who he was dealing with. A considerable number of humans do not." Ambrose's voice was measured, precise, and entirely without the smugness or cruelty she might have expected. If anything, he sounded, she searched for the word, reluctant, like someone delivering news they had not wanted to carry. "The court has not yet moved to collect because the debt is technically under administrative review. But that review ends in 30 days, and then what?" His grey eyes held hers steadily. "And then the court exercises its right of binding, which in practical terms means they attach themselves to your financial future in ways that are extremely difficult to remove. In less practical terms, it means a version of indentured service that the court has used for centuries against human heirs who cannot pay." Helena absorbed this with the particular focused calm of a person who processes fear by converting it into information. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You're sovereign witness for the court. You're supposed to be neutral." "I am neutral," he said. "I am also telling you the truth. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. They seem like they might be in this situation." For the first time, something almost like approval crossed his features. The debt was almost certainly incurred improperly. "Your father showed signs of prolonged thrall exposure in his final years, which I noticed only because I happened to review his case in the context of a broader administrative audit. The court is not aware that I noticed. So you're giving me 30 days to find a way out?" "I am giving you information," he said precisely. "What you do with it is your own decision." She had looked at him for a long moment across that bar table, this impossibly still, Impossibly beautiful vampire who had no obvious reason to be sitting here warning a human waitress about an ancient court's legal machinations. And she had asked the only question that felt relevant. Why does it matter to you? The pause before he answered was the longest he'd given any of her questions. Because the debt is wrong, he said finally, and I do not tolerate things that are wrong simply because they have been permitted to become tradition. Helena had taken the document, gone home, made herself a very strong pot of coffee, and started reading 29 days of research and translation and increasingly frantic cross-referencing of vampire blood law, which was, she had discovered, a genuinely elaborate and internally consistent legal system built on centuries of precedent, had brought her to the Obsidian Court's chamber with Clause 17 in hand, and Lord Casimir Draveth looking at her, as though she were an insect that had managed to fly in an interesting direction. Thrall coercion, Casimir said, each word landing like a stone dropped into still water, is an exceptionally serious accusation under blood law. You understand, Miss Thorne, that if you cannot substantiate it, the debt doubles. I understand. Helena kept her eyes on his. I also understand that under the blood law of 1743, the court has an obligation to conduct an independent review of any debt origin that is challenged on those grounds. That review must be completed within 7 days, and during those 7 days I cannot be bound. The silence this time had a different quality, tighter, like a wire pulled close to snapping. Casimir turned his siltal gaze toward Ambrose, with an expression that made it very clear he was connecting a number of dots he found extremely inconvenient. Sovereign witness, he said softly, has the mortal been coached? The sovereign witness has had no legal communication with the claimant, Ambrose said, and the way he said it was technically perfect because it was technically true. He had told her facts. He had not coached her in the law. Helena had found the law herself. The clause is in the document. The document was provided to the human claimant as is required under Article 3. Whatever she found in it, she found. Convenient, said Lady Seraphova from above, with a smile that showed teeth. The law is the law, Ambrose replied, and turned those storm-grey eyes toward Casimir with a directness that was, in the context of vampire court hierarchy, an extraordinarily bold move. Unless the court intends to argue that its own foundational documents should not be enforced. Casimir held the gaze for 3 full seconds, which, in a room of vampires, was a very long time. Then he lifted one hand in a gesture of practiced concession. The review will be conducted, he said. 7 days. He said the last 2 words looking directly at Helena, with an expression that communicated with absolute clarity that he considered 7 days to be more than enough time to make her situation significantly worse. Helena met his eyes and did not look away. The 7 days that followed were the most dangerous of her life, and they were also, in a way she would not have predicted and could not have stopped, the days in which she fell completely and irrevocably in love. Ambrose had appeared at her apartment door that same night, 1 hour after the court adjourned. He had not knocked so much as materialized on the other side of her door, in a way that suggested the concept of knocking was something he understood but found mildly beneath him. And when she opened it, he'd looked at her for a moment with that focused grey gaze and said simply, "You should not be alone for the next 7 days." Helena had stood in her doorway, in her work clothes still, hair up, smelling of wine and bar smoke, and considered him. Is that a genuine safety concern or a control impulse? Something flickered in his eyes. Both, he said with a directness she hadn't expected. I will not insult your intelligence by claiming it is only one. She had appreciated that more than she could easily express. She had stepped aside and let him in. Her apartment was small and aggressively lived in. Books stacked sideways on shelves that were already double-shelved. A desk covered in open legal texts and highlighted translations. A kitchen table buried under notepads. She watched him take it in and expected something. A slight curl of the lip, perhaps, the particular aristocratic disdain he clearly had access to. But instead his expression shifted into something that looked almost like recognition. You did all of this yourself, he said, moving to the desk and looking at the translations. In 29 days, 30 counting today. He picked up one of the notepad pages. His handwriting was nothing like hers. Hers was the pragmatic scrawl of someone who wrote fast and often, while his, she had seen in the ledger at the bar, was elegant and precise. He studied her work for a moment. This translation here is slightly off. The Latin compound here, per coactionem supernaturalem, it means not just coercion, but coercion specifically by means of supernatural power. You need that distinction to hold up under formal review. Helena leaned over his arm to look and felt, despite everything, the particular thrill of someone whose work has been seen and recognized by a person capable of seeing it properly. How slightly off? You had it as general coercion. The distinction matters under the 1743 law because the court will argue that ordinary social pressure from a vampire constitutes ambient intimidation, which is excluded. You need the specific mechanism. Thrall is the specific mechanism, and thrall falls under supernatural coercion. "Show me," she said, and pulled out a clean notepad. They had worked until 2 in the morning, and it had been one of the most extraordinary experiences of Helena's adult life. Not because of what they were doing, but because of how they did it together. Ambrose thought in long lateral lines, connecting precedents across centuries with the easy fluency of someone who had lived through the periods those precedents came from. Helena thought in concentrated bursts, finding the logical pressure points and pushing on them until they yielded. They disagreed 3 times. Twice he was right. Once she was, and he acknowledged it without hesitation, which she filed away as significant. At 2 in the morning, when she finally pushed her chair back and pressed her hands over her eyes. He had gone to her kitchen without being asked, found the coffee, and made it correctly, which she found oddly moving. "You know how to use a coffee maker," she said. "I have been alive for 412 years, he replied, setting the mug in front of her. "I have learned to use most things. Do you actually drink coffee?" "I drink it occasionally. The taste is not unpleasant, the effect does not register." He sat back down across from her with the focused, unhurried quality she was coming to understand as simply his natural state. "You have not asked me the obvious question." Helena wrapped her hands around the mug. "Which one?" "Why I didn't simply testify to what I observed in your father's case. I am sovereign witness. My testimony carries significant weight." She had in fact thought about this. "Because you can't," she said. "If you testify, Casimir will argue that you've compromised your neutrality, and they'll remove you as witness. Then whoever they replace you with almost certainly won't be working in my favor. If you stay neutral, you keep your position, and your position gives you leverage they can't simply vote away." He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table, and she had the sense of something settling, some decision being made or confirmed. "Yes," he said simply. "What did my father actually do to get into debt with the court?" she asked. "He borrowed money during a very difficult period. He was approached by a court intermediary, which is a human agent who works on their behalf, and given terms that were presented as reasonable. He signed without fully understanding who he was dealing with. By the time he understood, the thrall was already in play." He paused. "The agent responsible was sanctioned 3 years ago for a separate violation. The sanction is on record. It corroborates the pattern. Can we use the sanction record?" "If you can get it entered into evidence before the review panel." "Yes. Can you get me the record?" "The record is a matter of court archives, theoretically accessible to any party with a valid evidentiary claim under review." He looked at her steadily. "I can point you toward the correct archivist." "Point me then. Tomorrow evening, I will take you to the court's archive building." Helena nodded and drank her coffee, and in the particular quiet of her small kitchen at 2 in the morning, with legal documents spread across every surface and an ancient vampire sitting across from her with his white hair loose from the ribbon he'd been wearing it in, looking more human and more alien simultaneously than she knew how to process. She had felt something shift in her chest that she recognized as significant and chose, for the moment, not to examine too closely. She examined it later, lying awake. She examined it more the next evening. When he arrived at her door at 8 precisely, and she opened it to find him in what she was beginning to recognize as his informal wear, still all black, but without the court's more formal layers, his hair loose, carrying a leather satchel that turned out to contain additional archive documents he'd already obtained. She examined it at the archive building, which was a narrow Gothic townhouse, wedged between a modern bank and a cafe on a side street that most people walked past without seeing, when the archivist, a small, Ancient vampire woman who smelled of old paper and introduced herself only as Mira had looked between them and said with the candor of someone very old and thoroughly past, caring about diplomacy, "You're bringing a human to pull records. That's either very stupid or very brave." "Both, historically," Helena had replied, which had made Mira blink and then laugh, a dry sound like the rattle of parchment. She examined it most acutely on the fourth day. When the danger became concrete, she had been walking back to her apartment from the university library, where she'd been using their institutional database to cross-reference one of the precedent cases, when she became aware of the particular sensation of being followed. Not the vague urban unease of a city at night, but the specific, prickling certainty of eyes that were tracking her with intent. She turned onto a side street to test it and heard footsteps alter their rhythm behind her. She did not run. Running was an invitation to things that chased. Instead, she pulled out her phone and sent a single message to the number Ambrose had given her. "I have company." Corner of Schottengasse and Freying. She made it to the corner, stepped beneath a lit shop awning, and was preparing to make a great deal of noise, if necessary, when Ambrose was simply there. She genuinely could not have said how he had covered whatever distance he'd covered in the time between her message and his appearance. But there he was, between her and the two figures who had followed her from the library, and the transformation in him from the careful, precise man at her kitchen table to this was frankly breathtaking. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked at the two figures, both pale, both clearly vampire, both considerably larger than Helena, with an expression that conveyed with absolute economy that he was deciding whether to be tolerant of their existence or not, and that the decision could go either way.
"Whose house?"
he asked, with a quietness that was somehow more dangerous than shouting. The larger of the two said something in a language Helena didn't speak, and Ambrose replied in the same language. Still with that terrible quiet, and whatever he had said made the larger one visibly reconsider something. They exchanged 3 more sentences, and then the two figures left. Not quickly, but they left. Helena let out a breath she had not fully realized she was holding. Who were they? Casimir's household retainers. Ambrose turned to her, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, something raw and furious moved behind his eyes before it was contained again. "He is applying pressure outside the formal process. That is a violation of the review protocol. Can we use it?" He was already standing closer to her than he had been at any point previously, having placed himself between her and the direction the figures had gone, and he didn't immediately step back. "Yes," he said. "If it happens again and I can document it." "So I'm bait now." "You are not bait," he said with a sharpness that surprised her. "You are under protection. There is a significant difference, and I want to be very clear about which one this is." He was, she realized, genuinely angry on her behalf. Not performing anger, genuinely feeling it, and channeling it with the particular controlled ferocity of someone who had centuries of practice at not simply destroying things when he was furious. She found herself looking at him in the amber light of the shop awning, at the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, and the careful way as he was holding himself at exactly the right distance to be protective without being threatening to her. And she thought with sudden clarity that she had never in her life met anyone quite like him. "Ambrose," she said. Yes, she hesitated. She was not generally a person who hesitated. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual because she was good at reading people. Then he said, "Come, I'll walk with you." He walked with her back to her apartment, and they worked until nearly dawn. And at some point between 2 and 3 in the morning he had said something. She had been half asleep over a translation, and he'd pointed out a secondary clause they'd missed. And she'd laughed. A sudden genuine laugh that surprised both of them. And he had looked at her laughing with an expression she could only describe as hungry, but not in the way that word usually applied to vampires. Hungry in the way a person looks when they have been a long time without something that felt like warmth. On the 5th day, Mira the archivist sent a message through channels Helena didn't fully understand, which arrived in the form of a note slipped under her apartment door. The sanction record for the court intermediary who had approached her father was being formally flagged for transfer to the review file. Someone inside the archive had made it happen, On the sixth day, Helena finally asked the question she had been building toward for a week. They were in her kitchen again. He had brought food this time, actual food, from a restaurant she would not have been able to afford on her waitressing wages, and set it on the kitchen table among the legal papers, with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who has noticed a practical need, and addressed it without requiring acknowledgement. She ate and watched him not eat, and thought about how strange and comfortable this had somehow become, this coexistence, this rhythm. "You're 412 years old," she said, approximately. The precision becomes difficult after the first 2 centuries. Have you ever done something like this before? Protected a human through a court proceeding? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all her questions. "I have acted in the interests of proper legal process before. That is not uncommon for a witness. That's not what I asked." Another pause. "No," he said. "Not like this. What's different this time?" He looked at her across the table. And she had the sense of someone choosing between several things they could say and selecting the most honest one. "You," he said simply. The words sat between them, like something fragile and significant. "That's a very large thing to say for a vampire, who told me he was simply giving me information," Helena said, carefully. "I said I was giving you information," he replied. "I did not say information was all I was giving." "What else were you giving?" The storm cloud eyes held hers. "An opportunity," he said, "for you specifically. Because you are the kind of person who can do something with an opportunity which is rarer than you might imagine, across 4 centuries of observation." Helena set down her fork. "Ambrose, yes, I need to not fall in love with you before we finish this, because I will do it very poorly if I'm distracted." His expression did something complicated and beautiful. "A reasonable position," he said, after a moment that was just slightly too long. "I will try not to be distracting. You are constitutionally incapable of not being distracting. Also," he acknowledged with something that was almost a smile, "a reasonable position." They worked the rest of the night without touching, which required, Helena thought, a great deal of mutual effort. The 7th day arrived. The review panel convened in the Obsidian Court's chamber at 9 in the evening, because the court operated entirely on a nocturnal schedule and made no accommodations for solar-dependent biology. Helena had slept for 3 hours in the afternoon, dressed in the most formal thing she owned, a dark navy suit she'd bought for university interviews, and arrived with Ambrose at the door. He had looked at her when she opened her apartment door to him that evening, with an expression that moved through several things quickly before settling on composed. "You're ready," he said. "I look like I'm interviewing at a bank." "You look like someone who is not afraid," he said, "which is more useful." They entered the chamber together, which Helena knew from everything she'd read about court protocol was a statement in itself. The sovereign witness walking in with the human claimant, not escorting her in a formal protection capacity. Walking with her, several of the court members on the upper gallery noted it with expressions ranging from interest to displeasure. Casimir was already at his arbiter's dais, flanked by 2 other senior court members she hadn't seen at the initial proceeding. Lady Serafofova was in the gallery. And there were others she didn't recognize, older vampires, she thought, their stillness carrying the particular quality of great age, brought in as review panelists. "The review panel convenes," Casimir announced, with the ritual precision of someone who had presided over several centuries of such proceedings. "The claimant Helena Thorne challenges the validity of the debt under Article 9 of the Compact of Binding, invoking Clause 17. The panel will hear evidence." Helena stepped forward. She had her documents in a leather folder, organized, tabbed, translated where necessary. She placed the sanction record on the evidence table first, because it was the cornerstone of everything else, and she watched the 3 review panelists examine it with the careful expressionlessness of beings who had learned not to reveal reactions prematurely. "The intermediary named in the original debt contract," Helena said clearly, "was sanctioned by this court 3 years ago for the use of thrall-based coercion in a separate contract negotiation. The sanction record is before the panel. The pattern of conduct documented in that record matches precisely what I will demonstrate occurred in my father's case." She laid out the medical records next. Her father's behavioral changes in the 2 years before his death, the disorientation, the compliance, the uncharacteristic financial decisions documented by his general practitioner, none of whom had understood what they were seeing, but all of whom had noted the changes with professional concern. Thrall exposure presents in humans as progressive behavioral compliance, increasing disorientation around specific individuals or subjects, and unusual decision-making that is inconsistent with the subject's prior patterns, Helena said. These records show all three. The timeline corresponds directly to the period during which my father had contact with the court intermediary. Lord Casimir interrupted. Correlation is not causation, and a human physician's records constitute no evidence of supernatural causation under blood law. Correct, Helena said, and pulled out the next document. Which is why I am also presenting this. She had found it on the 6th night, a secondary record in the archives, accessible under the evidentiary claim process, which Mira had quietly flagged for her attention. A court internal communication from the intermediary's case file, documenting the specific targets of his thrall-based activities during the period in question. Her father's name was on the list. The chamber went very still, even Casimir's expression shifted just slightly. The court's own internal documentation, Helena said, keeping her voice absolutely level, places my father on a list of individuals targeted by an agent who was subsequently sanctioned for supernatural coercion. The debt that this court is attempting to collect is therefore invalid under Clause 17 of the Compact of Binding. I am requesting formal dissolution of the debt in its entirety. One of the senior review panelists, an ancient-looking vampire with deep-set eyes and the stillness of something geological, leaned forward. How did this internal document enter the evidentiary record? Through the archive's standard review process, Helena said, under Article 3. The panelist's eyes moved for just a moment toward Ambrose. Ambrose met the gaze with complete neutrality. The panelist returned to the document. Casimir, the panelist said, and his tone was no longer formal but something older and more authoritative. The tone of a creature who had been doing this since before the building they were standing in had been constructed. Did you review the intermediary's full sanction file before initiating collection proceedings against this human's inheritance? Casimir's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The intermediary's prior sanctions were not considered relevant to a separate debt. They are specifically cited as a review trigger in the 1743 law. The panelist set the document down. If the collection proceeding was initiated without reviewing the intermediary's known history, the proceeding itself is procedurally defective. He looked at the other two panelists, who had been reading in focused silence. The panel will confer. They conferred for 7 minutes, speaking in a language Helena didn't know, low and rapid. She stood at the evidence table and breathed carefully and did not look behind her at Ambrose, because she knew if she looked at him, she would lose precisely the composure she needed for the next several minutes. The senior panelist turned back to the chamber. The panel finds in favor of the claimant, he said. The debt is dissolved under Clause 17. All binding claims against Helena Thorne and the estate of her late father are herewith rendered void. Someone in the upper gallery made a sound that was not quite a word. Casimir said nothing, his face absolutely white and absolutely still, the expression of someone who had lost something they expected to keep and was computing the consequences with rapidly contained fury. Helena exhaled. Furthermore, the panelist continued, and his voice carried a new edge that made several people in the gallery straighten. The panel notes a violation of review protocol, specifically the use of household retainers to apply extrajudicial pressure to the claimant during the review period. Lord Casimir Dravith will answer to the full court for this separately. Casimir's gaze moved sharply toward Helena, then toward Ambrose, and the calculation in those silver eyes was very clear, he knew. He understood exactly how this had happened, the long chain of it. A sovereign witness who had chosen to give a human woman information. A human woman who had used that information with extraordinary competence. The two of them working in careful tandem across 7 days without ever technically breaking the rules that would have given Casimir leverage. He could not prove a violation, and he knew it. The human is released, Casimir said, each word bitten off cleanly. The proceeding is closed. Helena gathered her documents with steady hands. She turned finally and found Ambrose 3 feet behind her, which was where he had been throughout. present, watchful, positioned, but never stepping in front of her, never overriding her, letting her conduct every word of her own defense. His expression was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something significant and had it under careful control. She walked to him and stopped. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "We won." "You won," he corrected, with a precision that felt deliberate and important. She looked at him for a moment in the light of the torches, in this ancient underground chamber with its carved black stone and its gathering of old dangers, and thought about how very far this was from a bar in Vienna and table 7 and a glass of blood wine. And then she said quietly, because this was not a place for privacy, but she needed to say it anyway, "I am going to need to go somewhere that is not here and not be composed for approximately 5 minutes." Something finally broke open in his expression, controlled, still, but genuinely warm in a way that changed his face completely. "I know a place," he said. He knew a garden. She would not have expected it of him. A garden, of all things. Tucked into a private courtyard behind the old building where the archive was kept, accessible through a narrow passage that he led her through with the certainty of someone who had walked it many times. It was winter bare in the traditional sense. But the courtyard was enclosed and sheltered, with stone benches and iron lanterns that someone had lit, and the sky above the walls was deep city dark with stars faintly visible. And after the underground chamber, it felt like the first real breath of air she'd taken in hours. She sat down on a bench and pressed her hands over her face, and let herself shake for exactly the 5 minutes she'd promised herself, and he sat beside her, without touching her, and without saying anything, which was precisely the right thing. When she lifted her head, he was watching her with that expression she'd spent 7 days trying to categorize, and she had finally found the word for it. Reverent. It was reverent, and it looked entirely unconscious, the way a person looks when they're feeling something they haven't fully decided to feel yet. 412 years, she said. Yes, and you came to a bar and sat at table 7. I go to that bar frequently. The owner has an arrangement with the court that I helped negotiate, and I make a point of being visible in neutral spaces. But you asked for my name on that specific night. He was quiet for a moment. I had been watching you for several weeks, he said. With the directness she had come to understand was not bluntness but respect. He treated her intelligence as something not to be navigated around. You treated the vampires in the bar as people, not fearlessly in the way of someone who doesn't understand the danger, but with the specific kind of respect that comes from understanding the danger and choosing courtesy anyway. I found it. He paused. Remarkable. And then my father's case came across your desk. His name was in a review file I was auditing. I checked the connection and found the irregularity with the intermediary, and I knew. He looked at the iron lanterns. I knew that the court would move to collect and that the person in that bar would fight back if she had the information to fight with, and that she deserved to have it. That's a very complicated thing to have done for someone you'd observed from across a bar. I have had 4 centuries to become comfortable with complicated. Helena turned on the bench to face him more fully, folding one leg beneath her in a way that was probably very informal for the setting and absolutely not something she was capable of caring about. Ambrose, tell me something honestly. I have not yet told you anything dishonestly. Tell me whether what happened this week was only about justice. For you. He turned to face her as well, and in the lantern light his face was extraordinary. All that pale, sharp beauty, and all that controlled intensity and something beneath it that was surprisingly, genuinely open. No, he said. It was not only about justice. What was the rest of it? You, he said, as simply as he had said it at the kitchen table. Watching you work, watching you be unafraid, watching you laugh at 2 a.m. over a translation error, and eat the food I brought you without commenting on the fact that I didn't eat, and argue back at me when you were right, and acknowledge it when you were wrong, and... He stopped, reorganized. I am 412 years old. I have met a great many people. I have not experienced many of them the way I have experienced you this week. Helena looked at him, and thought about table 7 and 30 days, and the corridor where his retainers had materialized, and the garden, where he had sat next to her and said nothing, because saying nothing was what she needed. She thought about the coffee made correctly, and the food brought without announcement, and the particular way he positioned himself. Always close enough to act, never close enough to crowd, always letting her be in front. "I am going to be honest with you now," she said. "Please, I am a 26-year-old human woman who waitresses and studies contract law, and you are an immortal vampire of significant political standing in an ancient and powerful court, and I am not entirely sure how the logistics of any of this would work." "The logistics are complicated," he agreed. But, he said, waiting. "I have thought about almost nothing except you for 6 days," she said. "Which is deeply inconvenient given that I needed to think about contract law, and I would like very much to stop pretending I haven't." He reached across the small, cold space between them on the stone bench and took her hand. His hand was cool and absolutely still and large and very careful, and the way he held hers was the way someone holds something they are terrified of breaking, not because it is fragile, but because it matters. "Then stop pretending," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, because she was the kind of person who acted when she had decided a thing, and she had decided. His other hand came up to her face with extraordinary gentleness, and he kissed her back with the particular careful intensity of someone who has been wanting something for longer than they had acknowledged and is now allowing themselves to have it. He tasted of blood wine, and something older and stranger and entirely his own, and it was the best kiss of her life, which she recognized even as it was happening. When they separated, he looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the first time since she'd met him, and it made him look both older and younger simultaneously. The accumulated weight of 4 centuries and some irreducible core of something that had clearly been waiting a very long time to look at someone exactly like this. "The logistics," he said, "are extremely complicated. I know, vampires do not age. Humans do. I'm aware of how biology works. There are court implications, political ones. Casimir will not be neutral about this. Casimir is about to be answering to the full court for violating review protocol. I don't think he's in a position to be anyone's primary problem right now." He almost smiled, and almost smiling on his face was a thing she was going to spend considerable time appreciating. "That is also true." "Also," Helena said, "I am a contract law student who just used a vampire court's own foundational documents to dissolve a legally questionable debt that they've been trying to collect for 3 years. I think I can probably handle complicated logistics." He looked at her steadily. "There is a process," he said carefully, "under the older blood laws, a formal recognition of a bonded pair, human and vampire. It has not been used in several decades, but it is legally valid. It carries protections. Court protections, which means that any member of the court who moves against a formally recognized human partner of a court member is in direct violation of the Accord of Houses." Helena processed this. "So there is a legal mechanism that would protect me from court interference. Formally, yes, and it would require us to be what exactly? In what kind of arrangement?" He was very still. The terminology is archaic. The closest modern translation is formally declared partners. The commitment it implies is not casual. How not casual? Historically, it was considered permanent. "I'm 26, I know, and you're 412. Also known to me, yes." Helena looked at him in the lantern light of the winter garden, this impossible, beautiful, ancient creature holding her hand on a cold stone bench, and thought with the particular clarity that had gotten her through 7 of the most intense days of her life that she was not being asked to decide tonight, that he was not asking her to decide tonight, that he was giving her information as he had always done, and letting her decide what to do with it, and that this was, in its way, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. "Tell me about the process," she said, he told her. In the weeks that followed, the Obsidian Court underwent something of a reckoning. Lord Casimir Draveth's extrajudicial pressure on a claimant under review was taken extremely seriously by the court's elder members, who had the collective institutional memory to understand exactly what it meant if the review process could be contaminated by the very parties it was designed to arbitrate. The formal hearing took 3 weeks, and Helena watched none of it directly. But Ambrose came to her apartment in the evenings and told her, with the precise and detailed thoroughness she had come to rely on and love, exactly what was happening, translating the centuries-old political currents into language she could follow, Casimir was not removed from his position entirely, because the court did not do things that dramatically, preferring to adjust and constrain over time as befitted creatures who thought in centuries. But his authority was significantly curtailed, his ability to initiate new collection proceedings suspended pending a full review of his administrative conduct. Lady Serafova, who had significantly better political instincts, had distanced herself from him with the elegant swiftness of someone who had seen which way centuries were blowing before. Myra the archivist was formally commended, which she received with the dry indifference of someone who had been doing the right thing long enough that external commendation had become mildly redundant. The sovereign witness position was officially reviewed as well, because the elder panelist who had found in Helena's favor was thorough, and the review of Casimir's conduct necessarily involved examining every element of the proceeding. The review concluded that the sovereign witness had operated within his mandate, technically, precisely, and with complete fidelity to the letter of the court's own rules, which was both unimpeachable and, the elder panelist noted in his written finding, rather elegant. Ambrose had received this finding with complete composure, and told Helena about it that same evening, with the specific understated satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something difficult within narrow constraints and was quietly pleased about it. "You're proud of yourself," Helena said. "I am satisfied by the outcome," he said. "That's the same thing for you, perhaps." She was at her kitchen table with actual coursework for once. Her university program had continued regardless of vampire politics, and he was in the chair, across from her with his ledger, which had become a natural fixture of her evenings. He wrote in it and she studied, and occasionally one of them said something, and occasionally they sat in comfortable silence, and it had become, in the way of things that happen gradually, and then feel inevitable, simply what evenings were. 2 months after the court proceeding, on a Thursday evening in February, when snow was falling outside her apartment window in thick, soft curtains, Helena looked up from her contract law textbook and said, "I've been thinking about the formal recognition process." He looked up from his ledger, specifically about what you said, that the commitment it implies is not casual. She turned her pen over in her fingers. "I want to know what it means to you, not what the law says it means, what it means to you personally." He set the pen down. The ledger closed, not with a snap, but with the soft, deliberate care he gave all things. He looked at her across the kitchen table with those storm cloud eyes in the lamplight, with snow falling outside and the warmth of the apartment held against the cold. And he said, "It means that you are mine to protect and I am yours to hold accountable. It means that your safety is the primary obligation of my existence for as long as you live, and that my history and my position and my politics are open to you as information and as our weapons to use as you see fit. It means that when I tell you something, I tell you all of it, and when you need me, I come." He paused. "It means I love you, in whatever translation of that word applies to a being of my kind and my age, which I believe is a very concentrated and extremely permanent version of the thing." Helena was quiet for a moment. The snow fell. The lamp was warm. "That," she said, "is the most terrifying and wonderful thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know," he said. "I am sorry for the terrifying portion. Don't be." She stood up from the table and walked around it and sat in the chair next to him instead of across from him, which put them very close, and she took his hand, and he looked at her. "I love you," she said. "In whatever translation of that word applies to a person who is 26 and not immortal, and came into this by finding a legal clause in a vampire court document, which I believe is an extremely stubborn and thoroughly considered version of the thing." He turned his hand over and held hers with that extraordinary careful strength. "I know," he said very quietly. "Then let's talk about logistics." The logistics were, as promised, genuinely complicated. Helena finished her law degree, which took another 1.5 years, during which time she continued to work at the Red Lantern because she was not a person who abandoned things she'd committed to, and also because she was not yet financially independent enough not to, and also, frankly, because she liked it. She'd found that having a foot in the city's human world and a growing familiarity with its vampire world put her in a position that was genuinely useful and interesting. And she had always been a person who moved toward interesting things rather than away from them. Ambrose, for his part, managed the court's politics with the long-game patience of someone for whom the long game was entirely natural. The formal recognition process required a court acknowledgement, not approval. The distinction mattered, because the blood law did not require the court's approval, but did require its formal acknowledgement, and the difference meant the court could not refuse without violating the Accord of Houses, which even Casimir's remaining allies were not willing to do. The elder panelist, whose name was Voriath and who was old enough that several current court members had been children when he was already ancient, had made it quietly known that he considered the situation to be within the proper scope of historical blood law precedent, which was as close as a vampire of his position came to an endorsement. The formal recognition ceremony, when it came, was not a court proceeding, not the grand theatrical setting of the chamber with its carved black stone and its silver torches. Ambrose had deliberately not wanted that. He had arranged it in the archive courtyard, the same place with the iron lanterns and the stone benches, with the same small winter sky above the walls, because it was the place where she had kissed him first, and he was beneath all the centuries of formal composure, a person who paid attention to what mattered. Voriath presided, because Ambrose had asked him, and Voriath had agreed with the brevity of someone who found most things self-evident. Mira was there, because Helena had asked her, and Mira had arrived with a bottle of something very old and very strange, and an expression of dry satisfaction. A small handful of others were present, court members whose position or character Ambrose had trusted over the years, and 2 humans, her university friend Petra, who had been briefed with commendable calm on the reality of the supernatural world, and asked many excellent questions, and the bar owner from the Red Lantern, a half-vampire named Soren, who had known Ambrose for 60 years, and had watched Helena serve table 7 with the private satisfaction of someone who had seen how this was going to go before either of them had. The blood law's formal recognition was ancient and precise, and had components that were honestly a little gothic even by vampire standards. But Helena had read the full text twice and had no particular objection to any of it. Voriath spoke the binding words in the old language, and Ambrose translated them quietly for her as they were spoken, because that was what he did. He made sure she always had the information. She repeated what she was asked to repeat, in the old language, pronouncing it as best she could, from the phonetic guide Ambrose had written out for her. And Ambrose repeated his portion with the gravity of someone for whom words in an ancient language carried 4 centuries of weight. When it was done, Voriath produced the register, an actual physical book, centuries old, and they both signed it. And Voriath blotted the ink and closed the book and looked between them with the expression of someone who has seen a great many things in a great many centuries and is privately pleased by the specific sight in front of him. "The recognition is recorded," he said. "The court acknowledges." Ambrose turned from the register to Helena, and she looked up at him, and the smile that crossed his face was one she had come to understand, was rare and absolute, not the careful, controlled, almost smile she saw sometimes in the ordinary course of things, but the real one, the version that required him to stop managing his expression for a moment and simply feel the thing he was feeling. It made him look, for just that moment, like a person from 4 centuries ago who had been given something he had not expected the world to still contain. She stood up on her toes and kissed him in the courtyard with snow threatening above the walls and iron lanterns burning gold, and behind them Mira made a small sound of distinct approval, and Soren said something to Petra in a low voice that made Petra laugh, and Ambrose kissed her back with his hands in her hair. And that concentrated, permanent love she now understood how to translate. In the months and years that followed, Helena Thorne built something that had not quite existed before, which was a human presence within the Obsidian Court that was neither subordinate nor exotic but simply competent. She graduated and pursued a specialization in supernatural contract law, which existed as a formal sub-discipline in Vienna's legal world, if you knew which professors to find, and she turned out to be extraordinarily good at it, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. She worked on cases involving human heirs and court debts, establishing precedents that made it more difficult for court agents to operate the way the intermediary in her father's case had operated. Casimir watched this from his curtailed position with the cold calculation of someone composting grievances for future use. But Voriath remained a quiet presence in the background, and Ambrose remained the most powerful individual loyalty Helena possessed. And Casimir was not, at the end of his calculation, quite willing to find out what happened when he moved against both of those things simultaneously. He was wise, in the end, to be cautious. Because Helena had not stopped reading the Compact of Binding, and by her third year of practice, she had found 6 additional clauses she was fairly certain the court did not know she knew about. She kept them in a file on her desk with the annotation, contingency, because she was the kind of person who prepared for things and she was married, in all the ways that mattered. Across whatever translation of the word applied to their particular and extraordinary arrangement to an immortal vampire who had taught her, by example, to think in the long game, on the evening of their 2nd anniversary of formal recognition, Ambrose brought her to a place she hadn't been before, a room deep in the old building where the archive was kept, below the archive itself, where the oldest records of the court were stored. The room was lit by a single old lamp, and the walls were lined floor to ceiling with bound volumes that smelled of 8 centuries of accumulated history, and in the center of the room, on a reading stand, was a document under glass. "I want to show you something," he said. She leaned over the glass and read. It was a court record from approximately 400 years ago, and it documented, in the precise formal language of vampire blood law, the establishment of the sovereign witness position. The founding rationale, written in Latin, that she now read without difficulty was this: that the court required a position whose occupant could observe all proceedings with perfect impartiality, and that such a person's was defined not by their neutrality on outcomes but by their absolute commitment to truth, because truth was the only reliable constraint on power. And power without constraint was the only thing that could genuinely destroy the court from within. She straightened up and looked at Ambrose Volkov. "You've held this position for 100 years, she said. 107. And you spent all of that time being the most impartial person in the room. I tried to be. And then you sat at table 7 and watched a human waitress, and decided that giving her the truth was not a violation of impartiality. I decided," he said carefully, "that the truth is the truth, regardless of who receives it, and that withholding it because the recipient was convenient to the court's interests would have been the real violation." He paused. "I also decided that you specifically should have it. That part is not in the founding rationale." Helena looked at the document under glass. 4 centuries of history, 1 woman with a coffee pot and a notepad. The hidden clause in a bargain the court had assumed was final, and felt the full extraordinary weight of what had brought them here, which was not fate or magic, but something that felt to her more reliable than either of those things. It was a man who valued truth and a woman who pursued it, and the particular kind of love that grows between people who respect each other's minds before anything else. She turned from the document and looked at him in the lamplight of the oldest room she had ever stood in, and he was watching her with that expression, the rare, real one, and she thought he was the most remarkable creature she had ever encountered, and that she would spend the rest of her life thinking so. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you." He had become, in 2 years, considerably better at saying it outright, though it still carried the weight of someone to whom words had always mattered enormously. "I have been thinking. That sounds dangerous. There is a process older even than the formal recognition. Under the most ancient sections of blood law, a human who has been formally recognized and has demonstrated significant sustained engagement with the court's legal structure can petition for. The translation is imprecise. A kind of extended covenant. It does not make a human immortal. Nothing does that simply. But it does extend certain protections and, in documented cases from the court's earliest records, there is some evidence that proximity to a vampire of significant age and the formal bond of recognition has measurable effects on human longevity. Helena looked at him steadily. "You've been researching this for 2 years. Since the formal recognition? Since before it, actually. Since approximately the 3rd night you made coffee at your kitchen table." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the extraordinary careful love embedded in the statement. The fact that he had spent 2 years researching the legal and biological mechanisms that might mean she didn't have to age and die at the normal human rate, researching it quietly and preparing it thoroughly, and not mentioning it until he could present it as something real rather than something speculative. Because that was how he loved her, with information and preparation and truth. "What does the evidence say?" she asked. "Inconclusive but promising," he said. "The historical cases are limited. But some of the individuals who entered into formal recognition with court members in the oldest records lived significantly beyond the normal human lifespan. There are accounts suggesting double in at least 2 cases. So I might have more time than I think." "You might," he said carefully. "I cannot promise you immortality. I cannot promise you even a specific number of years. What I can tell you is that I have read every record in this building that bears on the question, and I believe, with appropriate epistemic humility given the limits of the evidence, that what is between us may give you more time than biology alone would suggest." Helena considered this with the focused seriousness she brought to all important things, and then she took his hand and she said, "Then we'll use it well." "Yes," he said. "We will." He pulled her closer in the oldest room in the building, and she went, and his arms around her were cool and strong and impossibly careful, and she thought about table 7 and 30 days, and the hidden claws and the courtyard, with the iron, lanterns, and everything that had grown from a single honest conversation between a vampire who valued truth and a human woman who refused to be afraid. Outside, Vienna continued to exist in its complicated, layered way, the city of the living on the surface, and below it, the older world, the one that had been here before the streets were paved and would be here long after, the world of courts and blood law, and ancient vows and dangerous devotions. The world that Helena Thorne had walked into with a notepad and legal text and had, improbably and irreversibly, made into something that contained her. She was 28 years old. She had no idea how many years she would ultimately live. But she was standing in the arms of a man who had spent 2 years reading every record that existed on the subject, and she trusted his research, and she trusted him, and she was not, in any corner of herself, afraid. "There is one more thing," Ambrose said into her hair. "Of course there is," she said. "Voriath has asked me to consider a formal advisory role for you, with the court, not as a human dependent or a witness's partner. As a legal consultant in your own capacity. There is no precedent for a human holding such a position, which means the law doesn't prohibit it, precisely." Helena pulled back enough to look at his face. "He wants to set a precedent. He is very old," Ambrose said. "Old enough to have seen the court make a great many mistakes by excluding perspectives it should have included. He told me, and I am quoting him accurately, that any institution which has existed for 8 centuries without formally consulting any humans has developed what he called a structural blind spot that will eventually kill it." He's not wrong. He is rarely wrong. He is occasionally inconvenient, but rarely wrong. "And you?" Helena asked. "What do you want?" He looked at her with those storm cloud eyes in the old lamplight. This vampire who had sat at table 7 and chosen truth over neutrality and love over 4 centuries of careful isolation, and he said, "I want whatever you want. I want you to have every room you're capable of filling, which is most of them. I want you to read every clause the court has ever written and find the ones they forgot about. And I want to watch you use them. I want to be unreasonably proud of you at formal court proceedings for the foreseeable future, which I understand may be a long time." He paused. "And I want to come home to this, whatever form this takes. I want this to be what I come home to." Helena looked at him for a long moment. At the 412 years and the extraordinary stillness and the storm cloud eyes, and the love that was very old and very concentrated and entirely certain of itself. And she thought that she had walked into the Obsidian Court with a document in her hands and found, in a clause so small the court had forgotten it existed, not only her freedom but the beginning of everything. She reached up and put her hands on his face and kissed him in the oldest room in the building, and he kissed her back with the whole of that concentrated permanent love, and somewhere above them the court of ancient dangers continued its centuries-old business. And somewhere in the archive Mira was cataloguing records, and the iron lanterns were burning in the courtyard, and Vienna's snow was falling, and Helena Thorne, who had been a waitress with a legal text and a very long week, was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was, as it turned out, precisely the right place. The bargain the court had thought was final had ended, and everything that was better than a bargain had begun.